Welcome back to the No Nonsense Sustainability Podcast. I'm your host, Ildiko Amashi-Simsik, and today it's just me and Bob the Buzzer for this episode. This is my first solo because I wanted to talk to you about the safeguards from a historic perspective. If you're like me and you're super into the E&S field and how the development banks went through this evolution of environmental and social policy to come up with these standards, then you're going to love this. I know I probably should have buzzed myself. So by environmental and social standards, I mean the set of requirements that govern the investment decisions of development banks and international financial institutions. And these usually cover environmental and social impacts of the given project or the investment. And the reason these are important is because they're really shaping our thinking about what gets built and how it gets built, because there's a difference between a sustainable asset and assets that are managed in a sustainable way. But we're going to get through the little bit of a history of how it emerged. And I wanted to make it a solo episode because I couldn't find anybody who's as much of a geek about this as I am. So here we go. First solo, go easy on me. Picture this. It's the late 1980s. We're standing on the banks of the Narmada River in India. Thousands of villagers, activists, and students. They're chanting, marching, and demanding to be heard. The government plans to build a massive dam. It promises irrigation, electricity, and economic growth. But for the people who live there, it means displacement, loss of homes, and a river ecosystem completely destroyed. The World Bank helped fund that project, and the protests that followed really shook the institution to its core. It was not prepared to deal with this outrage. But out of this came something new. The idea that development finance must protect the people and the planet and not just build things. These rules that are now called safeguards were born out of the real harm that this project meant for these people. And today, these very standards shape trillions of dollars in global finance. But there's always a twist, because right now we're seeing the biggest shift we've been talking about for decades. The World Bank and its private sector arm, the IFC, are aligning more closely than ever, even merging the key functions after many, many years of speculation. They already shared very similar standards, but this convergence marks a milestone. And it raises new questions about what happens next, especially as rising institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Development Bank, the newest kid on the development finance block, begin to craft their own blueprint for these standards. So today we'll trace the story, how safeguards evolved from protests into policy, and we're going to see where they're heading next. But let's rewind and go back to the 70s and the 80s to see how it all really began. After World War II, the world wanted to rebuild. Institutions like the World Bank were created to make that happen faster and perhaps more sustainably. The focus was growth, means big infrastructure, highways, dams, pipeline, everything you can imagine. But in a rush to build, the human and environmental costs were often just ignored. By the 1970s, things were changing. Environmental movements were spreading across the world. And the 1972 Stockholm Conference put the environment on the global agenda. And soon the cracks in development models became very visible. Entire forests cleared, communities displaced without compensation, health risks ignored. One scandal, the Polo Noroeste highway in Brazil, showed what could go wrong. It opened the Amazon to deforestation on a massive scale. It faced global criticism, and as a result, the World Bank began to rethink its role. In 1980, it quietly issued a short environmental policy, and by 1987, that became a formal commitment. Projects had to assess the environmental impact of the investment, so it was still very much ring-fence. And then came the social sides with the indigenous rights, the involuntary resettlement, and the community consultation. For the first time, the bank wasn't just a lender. It was a norm setter. And when people still weren't being heard, the bank created something revolutionary. The inspection panel in 1993. The inspection panel was a formal way to communities to file complaints and hold the bank accountable. Around the same time, the IFC, the bank's private sector arm, began creating its own rules. Its performance standards, first drafted in the 1990s, became the backbone for private sector safeguards worldwide. These early years were chaotic, and the message was still clear that development banks should do no harm through their investments. From protests and pressure came these policies and precedent. Now, let's see how these ideas spread across different development banks, continents, and decades. Once the World Bank acted, other development banks followed. Let's take a quick tour around our favorite IFIs. The World Bank itself modernized its safeguards into one comprehensive system, the Environmental and Social Framework, approved in 2016, effective in 2018. The IFC, serving private sector clients, had its own performance standards that were last overhauled in 2012, and they're currently undergoing a review with the hope of having the updated standards operationalized by 2028. And these standards became the model for global private lenders worldwide. The Asian Development Bank combined its environment, resettlement, and indigenous policies into one in 2009 called the Safeguard Policy Statement, and it's now being refreshed to integrate gender and climate resilience, some of the cross-cutting issues we've seen emerging. The African Development Bank launched its integrated safeguard system in 2013 and then strengthened it with biodiversity, gender protections in its 2022 update. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development updated its own policies in 2014 when I was still working there, in 2019, and more recently in 2024, aligning closely with the bank's approach, but adding human rights, supply chain, and risk-based assessment focus for transition economies. And what about the newer players? The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank in Shanghai borrowed very heavily from these earlier models. However, they had this mindset of trying to do better and trying to work differently with perhaps less bureaucratic ideas and more pragmatic approaches for their clients. They update their frameworks every couple of years to be even faster, more flexible, and stay competitive in the development finance industry. Across all of them, a pattern appears. Older banks evolved reactively, usually after a public outcry, while the newer banks act more proactively, adding climate, gender, human rights before the crisis hits. But harmonizing these systems has become a challenge. When multiple banks finance a single project, whose rules apply? Well, everyone's, right? But now, inside the World Bank Group itself, the lines are blurring even further. The IFC and the World Bank are integrating systems and teams, part of what insiders were calling the One World Bank Group approach, which brings us to today's milestone moment where the standards converge. For decades, the World Bank and IFC operated separately. Same family, but different missions and different clients. The World Bank dealt with the governments and public policy, and IFC worked with the private companies and the investors. Their safeguard systems were very similar, but understandably not identical. There were speculations during the World Bank Safeguard Standards update that they should be combined and there should be one set of safeguard standards for both IFC and the World Bank. But this idea did not make it into reality then. The World Bank required more policy compliance, while IFC emphasized the risk management, performance management, continuous improvement aspects. Now, after decades of speculations, the two institutions are finally aligning more closely, merging key functions together such as treasury, risk management, safeguards, and knowledge sharing. It's not just a technical move, it's really a historic shift because it might mean that the same set of environmental and social standards could govern both public and private sector projects under the umbrella. We've seen this model with EBRD and to a certain extent ADB, but it might happen that they will keep separate standards to be more pragmatic and make project delivery easier. Using the same standards could bring consistency, but it can also raise some real questions about how the projects get delivered. Will the stronger rules hold? Will this alignment lead to a compromise or just the lowest common denominator, to keep the investors comfortable and to keep the business booming? Either way, this marks a turning point. The convergence of public and private finance means that safeguards now live at the very heart of global development. And this shift doesn't just affect the existing institutions. It's really shaping how new banks will design their standards from scratch. But let's go back to Shanghai. At the 2025 SCO Summit in Tianjin, member states agreed in principle to establish the SCO Development Bank with a huge 2 billion initial funding and in grants and an additional 10-14 billion in concessional loans from China. This move marks a significant step in the SCO's evolution from a regional security bloc to a more comprehensive development institution. The SCO Development Bank is poised to play a very pivotal role in financing infrastructure, energy, and connectivity projects across Eurasia. We've seen the emergence of development banks based in China with AIIB and the New Development Bank. And the SCO Development Bank gives another very modern, very agile, and very competitive development bank to this mix. The strategic importance of this bank is underscored by China's commitment to seeding the bank with substantial financial resources, signaling a shift towards greater economic integration within the SCO framework. Proportionality. This is now part of the newer set of standards and the approach to risk management. So by building in proportionality, it can apply lighter safeguards for low-risk projects and stronger oversight for the high-risk ones. It may also lean on borrower country systems, letting local laws apply when they meet international norms, but layering these additional plus requirements when gaps appear. Now, we can argue over the adequacy of country national systems. Most often, if you ask the colleagues in ADB or the World Bank, they say that all of these country systems need strengthening. But let's see what the future brings for the SCO Development Bank. Also, given the identity of this new bank as a Global South institution, the safeguards might be designed in a way that speak more directly to emerging market realities, covering land tenure, climate mitigation, and social inclusion. In short, the SCO Development Bank could really become the bridge between traditional Western safeguard systems and the new multipolar world of development finance. It will likely mirror the IFC World Bank model and structure, but adapt for speed, flexibility, and the regional context. Because while the framework matters, how it applies and who benefits matters even more. The next decade could really redefine what responsible development actually looks like. But let's zoom out for a moment. We started with protesters on a riverbank fighting for their homes, compensation, the environment. That struggle gave birth to the world's first safeguards policies. These policies spread across development banks, evolved over time, and are now converging again, this time under the World Bank and IFC's closer alignment of safeguards. Meanwhile, institutions like the SCO Development Bank, New Development Bank, and AIIB in China are preparing to write the next chapter, one that could balance local ownership, climate urgency, and global responsibility. Safeguards began as a resistance. They became a policy, and now they're becoming global norms. Yet, we often struggle with the implementation, even when working with well-established companies. We still have complaints and protests against these projects. Can we really say that these safeguards work? How can we implement them in a better way? Are they really that hard to comply with? So I want to leave you with a question. As the lines blur between public and private finance, how do we make sure that the rules that protect people and the planet don't get blurred too? Should safeguards keep expanding to include things like data rights, artificial intelligence, climate migration? Should they become living standards that are ever evolving instead of these fixed systems? Or should they simplify so they actually get implemented and not buried in the paperwork? I'd love to hear what you think. So send your thoughts, your stories, your ideas, and let's keep this conversation alive. Thank you for being here with me today. We went from protest to policy, from rivers in India, and ended up in the boardrooms in Shanghai, building new institutions with new sets of safeguards. But the story of safeguards reminds us that the real progress isn't just about what we build, it's also about who we protect along the way. Thanks for listening to my first solo episode on safeguards, and we'll be back with more.